Guilty of a crime he's yet to commit in Minority Report in an hour on BBC One Scotland.
Nearly 500,000 people working in a British industry.
The industry has got a huge role to play in the sort of economic wealth of the planet.
A European country virtually self-sufficient in oil.
Oil is the basic wealth of a nation if you have it, and cherishing it, nourishing it, encouraging it, controlling it was what national policy should be about.
A bigger oil producer than Kuwait.
I've never been to a casino in the world in my life, but I work in the biggest casino in the world. It's the oil industry.
This is our oil industry. Could it be the key to understanding Scotland? Its past, its present, and its future. Hello, I'm Hayley Miller. For the last 10 years, I've been BBC Scotland's business correspondent. A few months back, when the price of crude oil broke through $100 a barrel, it was splashed across every newspaper and every news programme. And with an oil industry off the Scottish coast worth billions and billions of pounds, I wanted to find out what oil really means to Scotland. This investigation would take me back into the past and forward to the future. And what I'd find out is that understanding oil helps you to understand Scotland and its place in the world.
America is addicted to oil.
Oil shaped the 20th century. It's so valuable that countries fight wars over it. In 1990, Saddam Hussein's Iraqi army blew up the oil wells as they retreated from Kuwait. Some historians believe Hitler lost the Second World War because he didn't have enough of it. And today, oil is so important to our lives, a rising price causes chaos.
It's now as high, I think, today as $130 a barrel. And I think all of you know the impact that's having on household bills and the follow-through for prices of consumer goods like food.
So how important must oil be to a country like Scotland, where we have it right on our doorstep? Having your own oil gives you political muscle. Margaret Thatcher's top civil servant, Sir Bernard Ingham, believes having your own oil supply is vital to a nation state.
If we didn't have it, how much would we have to pay across the world for it, because the price is going up, and how much more insecure would we be, given Mr. Putin's proclivities in switching off the oil, and of course the fact that a lot of oil and gas is in the hands of Islamic nations.
Britain's oil or Scotland's oil? A contentious question. Whatever your answer, oil's been pumping ashore in Scotland for the past 30 years, and yet few of us see ourselves as an oil nation. I need to get to the bottom of Scotland's relationship with oil, so I'm heading off to see this industry for myself.
Well, I'm now heading offshore to the Claymore oil platform. It's 110 miles northeast of Aberdeen. I'm going to take a closer look at the oil industry.
Claymore started processing oil just over 30 years ago. It's been owned and operated by the Canadian company Talisman Energy for the last 8. It was just coming back on stream after a 2-week maintenance shutdown when I arrived. 23-year-old Glenn Graffin is one of the latest generation of offshore workers.
Yeah, go ahead, Richard.
You have in position now, if everything's all right up there?
Yes, that's okay.
So what are you saying to him here? What's about to happen?
He's about to open it up, and then I mean, everything's quite steady here, so should see Gordon's opened up another well there, and it should.
I soon find out there are nearly 40 different wells producing oil here. Glenn tells me that Claymore's massive pipeline sends the oil to the Flotta terminal in Orkney, and that the pipeline's running at capacity.
Never had to go up there, thankfully. It's quite high up. You can see all the drilling pipes. I think they said they're a way to start doing some drilling work, whether it's intervention or if they're drilling a new hole, I'm not sure.
This is a huge industrial complex. It's unlike any I've seen before. It happens to be sitting in the North Sea, in the middle of nowhere.
This is my first time offshore, and what I find so remarkable about it is just how much of a sense of community there is here. It's like living in a remote village, and it's totally self-contained. They generate their own electricity, their own water. Apart from that, everything else has to be brought here by boat.
There are 284 platforms like this, and I've discovered that in total they produce more oil than Kuwait. Why don't we hear about that? Is it a case of out of sight, out of mind? Claymore's been here since the late 70s, but to understand our relationship with oil, I need to go further back in my investigation. It all started back in the 60s when Scotland beat the world champions and Celtic became the first British team to win the European Cup. Gas had been found off the coast of England, but something much bigger was about to happen off Scotland. In Aberdeen, a young economist was getting excited about the potential treasure in the North Sea. He eventually became the official historian of North Sea oil.
It wasn't until '69 when the big discovery of Ekofisk in the Norwegian sector was made that more interest in the central sector came, and of course it was all dramatized by the discovery of Forties in 1970.
Okay, you ready? Roger. Okay, here we go. We have crash lap now.
So by the mid-70s, it was clear that the UK continental shelf was going to be a major province, even by world standards.
With the 70s came a time for celebration, and not just because of oil. At the Edinburgh Commonwealth Games, Scotland won 25 medals.
And Ian Stewart wins from Ian McCafferty.
Lulu was the top female singer.
Boom, bang, a bang, bang, close to you.
And the Bay City Rollers in their tartan trews were taking the country by storm. But the truth was that Scotland and the rest of Britain was struggling. 3-day weeks and uncollected rubbish were crippling the country. Gradually, even though a single drop of oil hadn't yet come ashore, the government was pinning its hopes on the North Sea. In 1972, a young Scottish economist was headhunted from his position at Oxford University to become economic advisor to the Scottish office. For the next 20 years, it was a role which Gavin McCrone fulfilled, and he recalls how important North Sea oil was to become.
I think Edward Heath, the Prime Minister, was very concerned about this. I mean, I think he saw that there was going to be benefit. And the United Kingdom was in a very difficult economic situation then, and he saw North Sea oil as something that had to be developed fast in order to give us some help. I think it was when oil discoveries started coming in thick and fast, and you would hear that an oil discovery had been made, then some time later, whether it was commercially viable and so on. But that started to happen thick and fast, and that created a totally different atmosphere, quite exciting actually.
The excitement about oil was running high in Scotland. The Scottish National Party sent 11 MPs to Westminster on the slogan, "It's Scotland's oil." Everyone wanted to be a part of the new black gold.
as a youngster or a teenager sitting watching the ads of Brent on the TV, you know, before entering this industry, and I was at school, I had no idea that I would, later in my life, I guess, and now on 3 occasions, be closely associated with Brent.
There came a time when natural resources became so precious that men were forced to seek them in alien environments. From all over Earth, men and materials were gathered, machines the like of which had never been seen before. This mighty endeavor required a vast investment and a leap of technology as great as that which placed the first men on the moon.
So I kind of look back and smile and when I saw those moonscape ads of Brent in the 70s.
The oil industry was inspiring Scots like John Gallagher, and while other nations had to worry about brain drains and losing their talent, North Sea Oil was enticing Scots back home, including one young Aberdonian working in the sunny climes of the Caribbean.
No reason to get excited.
Was invited to come back to the UK to help in the conversion of a tanker that was going to load oil off what was called the Montrose Alpha platform. I didn't know anything about this, except what I did know was that the North Sea, where I was born, was a pretty grey and inhospitable place, where I was much more happy in the Caribbean or the Mediterranean. But they took me up to the vessel and we did the conversion, sailed it out to the North Sea, and all of a sudden there's this fantastic structure coming out of the North Sea, and clearly for me this was a life-changing experience in terms of where my career could go, because I had no idea that this phenomenal industry was just emerging on my own doorstep.
Oil wasn't just shaping future careers for people like Tom Smith and John Gallagher. It was about to determine the course of Scotland and the UK forever. Britain was struggling. The miners were striking. And to cap it all, the Organisation of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, forced up the price of our oil imports. The country was almost bankrupt. Even before the first barrel of oil had been produced, it was being seen as a lifeline. The desire to get it flowing wasn't just driven by Scottish pride, but by British survival. Britain's new Secretary of State for Energy welcomed the first North Sea oil ashore. It was a momentous day for the government and for Tony Benn.
It does give this country a great opportunity, which it's long needed, of developing a full four-fuel economy. We will be, in time, one of the 10 largest oil-producing countries in the world.
I was appointed in June 1975, and one of the first jobs I had to do was to be present when the first North Sea oil came off.
Well, this is it, the first few drops of our North Sea oil. So far, this jugful has cost £3,000 million and taken nearly a decade to get.
And here is the actual bottle. I've got a picture of myself somewhere holding it up, and I think it probably is still, it's pretty clotted, I think, now, but it is genuine, and that was seen as the future, and quite properly so, because if we'd used it wisely, our economy would have been an awful lot stronger now.
Oil was seen as the future, a future free from the crippling prices imposed by OPEC. This explains why North Sea oil was so important to Britain in 1975.
I think there was a very wide recognition, because it did give us, it was understood to give us a lifeline at a time the economy was in serious difficulties. I don't think anybody underestimated it. I think you could argue that in the sense that it won't last forever, it might have been slightly overestimated. But, oh, people appreciate, look at the coverage at the time, it was phenomenal. What would North Sea oil do?
Whatever it would do, the government clearly didn't expect it to last long. Tony Benn's press secretary at the time was Bernard Ingham, and he recalls an event his boss held.
Tony Benn called a conference in Church House, Westminster, where the consensus. I've never trusted people since. The consensus was that North Sea oil would be done and dusted by, well, oil and gas, I suppose, done and dusted by, as I recall it, 1995.
How long will North Sea oil last? A deceptively easy question with no simple answer. These government papers in the 1970s state that the oil in the North Sea will be exhausted in the 90s. And they refer to a Treasury meeting in Westminster, which Gavin McCrone attended.
I certainly thought in those papers, which have been dug up now from the records, I was quite surprised to see what I said in many cases. But one of the things I clearly was expecting was that the oil would last about 20 years, and that would be that. Well, it's now more than 30 years, and it's still there. So I didn't foresee that it would go on as long as it has done.
Even now, many people think that North Sea oil is about to run out. People like environmental campaigner Jeremy Leggett, who's chairman of the company Solar Century.
I think if I had to guess, the crunch is going to come in 2010, plus or minus 2 years. If you look at the flow rates, not the stated reserves, the proved reserves, or all the arguments about reserves, just the flow rates in the projects that are reported by the oil industry coming on stream, you see that around 2011, you see the flow rates drop off quite spectacularly. And that's the time, I think, when a lot of people are going to wake up to what's going on and start asking the fundamental questions about what life is going to look like in the second half of the age of oil.
Speaking to people like Jeremy Leggett and Gavin McCrone sums up the fundamental problem of investigating Scotland's relationship with oil. How can we get to grips with it if no one can agree on how much oil there is or when it's going to run out? One person who's spent a considerable working life studying and writing about oil and oil reserves is Professor Peter O'Dell.
Well, let's say first that the oil is not declining. It is sometimes presented by people as being in decline, or oil as having reached its peak. If there's a peak, it's not going to be due to the lack of supply, it's going to be due to the lack of demand.
So how much is he actually talking about?
There are at least 20, 25, even 30 billion barrels of the stuff left, and that's quite a lot. It's not quite as much as we use already, but it's not far short, so there's a lot to go for. And moreover, there are still parts of the UK continental shelf that have never been examined at all in any great depth. And so that could be the low end of a range which would take us into a period when we have access to as much oil again as we've already used, if not more.
No two people seem to agree on how much oil there is left in the North Sea. So to find an answer, I've decided to follow the money. Business people rarely invest in anything unless they're sure they'll get a return. So I'm going to Shell's head office in Aberdeen. Remember the teenager excited by oil in the 70s? Well, he's now one of the top people here responsible for the North Sea. So I'm going to ask him whether he thinks the North Sea has a part to play in Shell and Scotland's future.
We've been perhaps the largest, or certainly one of the leading investors in the North Sea. We're bringing 4 fields on, 4 new fields in this mature environment, bringing 4 new fields on this year. We're talking hundreds of millions of pounds. The plant rejuvenation work that we're doing is hundreds of millions of pounds. The work that we're doing cross-border across the North Sea, linking up Norway and the UK, which is a growing trend in our industry, again, hundreds of millions of pounds.
So there seems to be quite a lot of the black gold left in the North Sea. My investigation shows at least 25 billion barrels, and that's a conservative estimate. Now, to get to the bottom of understanding oil, I'm not taking anything for granted. We always hear people talk about barrels of oil, but what exactly is a barrel of oil? Well, here's the lowdown. 1 barrel is exactly 42 US gallons of crude oil. That's approximately 159 litres. But a barrel as such no longer exists. These days it's simply a notional measurement, the history of which dates back 120 years, way before oil was transported in tankers like this. So what's in it? Typically, that notional barrel of crude North Sea oil will be refined to give almost 5 litres of LPG, almost a full tank of petrol for a family car, 40 litres of diesel, or enough kerosene to move a jumbo jet for just over a mile. And even after all that, there's still about 12% left, which can be used to produce electricity. And here's the hard bit. The term, a barrel of oil, can also be applied to a specific measure of how much energy is released when you burn a barrel of oil. Here's the equation. The next key element in understanding Scotland's relationship with oil is understanding why the price of oil keeps going up and up. Before this investigation, I thought it was because oil was running out. But the experts think there's another factor at work.
Pure speculation, in the main. Some elements of supply and demand, some elements of the increasing cost of getting oil out of the ground. But if we take those two factors into account, and only those into account, then the $100 a barrel oil should be nearer 35 to 40. The rest is the speculator's gain.
Peter O'Dell isn't the only person to think it's the speculators. The minister responsible for oil in the UK, Malcolm Wicks, acknowledges it too.
When I talk to OPEC ministers about this, their view is that supply is not the problem. They argue there's plenty of supply at the moment, and it is all about psychology. Someone might say madness in the markets. They say it's about speculation. I personally think the fundamentals are the things to emphasise, but clearly, like many other issues, there are a number of factors now behind the record price of a barrel of oil.
So according to O'Dell and OPEC ministers, the main reason why oil is so expensive is because so many people want to take a punt on it and on how high the price will go. He's adamant that it has little to do with reported shortages.
We have a world which is replete with oil resources to a degree that now far exceeds that of any other time. Taking the last 10 years as an average of increasing use of oil over this period, one finds that the annual rate of increase is only just over 1% per annum, 1%. And this is the longest period since the end of the Second World War that there has been so little global increase in demand for oil.
No shortages because of demand. What about supply?
Over the past 10 years again, one looks through the declaration of proven reserves, which are those reserves which are thought to be available at current costs and current prices. One finds that there has been a continuing increase in the availabilities of oil, resources, the reserves, of the order of 2.5% per annum. And so we now have more oil which has been declared as being in the ground than ever before. And it's roughly the equivalent of 44 years of the current rate of demand. So there's a lot of oil to go, even if no more is found.
There's still huge amounts of resource of oil and gas left in the North Sea and the wider UK continental shelf. My guess would be that we'll still be exploring and extracting oil and gas, certainly for the next 4 decades, maybe beyond that.
All this sounds like very good news for Scotland and our oil industry. As long as the price is rising, every barrel in the ground is becoming more valuable. So it makes perfect economic sense to go after it. Someone who knows well the economics of oil is a politician and former economist. At the Royal Bank of Scotland, he launched an index to track Scotland's oil industry, and the bank's still using it today. He's Scotland's First Minister, Alex Salmond.
Well, all oil provinces go up and down with the oil price. I think it would be a reasonable suggestion, unless you want to turn the laws of supply and demand and likely forecasts on their head, that we can safely assume, for the sake of argument, that the average price of oil and gas over the next 30 years is going to be substantially higher in real terms than it's been over the last 30 years. And although, of course, it is true that you're into areas of higher cost of exploration, and of course the intense activity bids up the price of resources, you're still talking about a very comfortable margin in terms of viability.
If the economics are looking good for the oil companies, could the future be looking good for Scotland and those employed in our oil industry? Drilling for oil is about taking risks. A high oil price makes those risks more worthwhile. Someone who's taking plenty of risk in the North Sea is Oilexco's chief executive, Arthur Mulholland.
Last year, we drilled 39 out of 120 exploration and appraisal wells drilled in the UK sector. In 2004, we were paying approximately $55,000 a day for a drilling rig. Today we're paying $350,000 a day, and these are American dollars, which is priced in. So even though the price of oil today is higher than it was in 2004, our costs of doing business have increased just as dramatically.
Once they've found the oil, it still takes years to produce it. John Gallagher from Shell explains how far into the future they plan.
Our industry makes investments on a 10, 20, 30-year horizon, and so look at that horizon of profitability and you will quickly find that you get into levels of profit margin that might be 10 to 15%. That's not too different from your average industry.
There's obviously a lot of money to be made in the North Sea, but who benefits most? The oil companies, governments, or ordinary people like you and me? Well, to answer that, I need to find out how successive governments have negotiated with the oil barons. Someone with an insider's perspective is Gavin McCrone from the Scottish office.
On the whole, we had, I think, very good relations with them. And especially the British ones, BP and Shell. Some of the American ones, we got on fine with them, but it took them a while to adjust to the way in which we operate in this country.
Once again, the story of North Sea oil reflects the politics and culture of the country. In 1976, the hue of the country was definitely socialist, as Tony Benn decided to create a national oil company headquartered in Glasgow.
A lot of people said you mustn't frighten the oil companies away, but I knew quite well that I couldn't I didn't want to frighten them away, but I couldn't frighten them away because they desperately needed the oil. It was just fairly soon after the oil crisis of 1973. I would talk to the oil companies. For example, Esso wouldn't cooperate with me. And I said, well, this is what we're trying to do. And they said, well, we're not going to do it. So I said, OK, doesn't matter. So they didn't get any oil. So a year later, the president of Esso came back and invited me to lunch. I had a word with him. I said, how's your golf? How's your wife? Didn't discuss oil with him. And he was absolutely terrified because he needed the oil and I had the oil. So I was then in a position, you see, to lay down the conditions under which they could have bits of the North Sea.
This was a bold move at the time. 30 years ago, there were hardly any nationalised oil companies. Today, state-owned corporations hold 4/5 of the world's oil, so the trend definitely caught on. While Tony Benn was dealing with the oil companies, his press secretary Bernard Ingham was also learning about the intricacies of negotiation.
Well, the oil companies are used to dealing with governments. They have to deal with government. And of course they would exercise the usual little bits of sophisticated blackmail, which say, oh, we're going to be disappearing over the horizon if we are taxed anymore. And all this was a wonderful game of poker. And you knew what the objective was, to achieve a balance whereby they stayed and we got some more money.
Listening to how Bernard Ingham and Tony Benn related to the oil companies, I can begin to understand their views of big business. I've discovered all governments' dealings with the big oil companies come down to the same thing. How much tax can governments get from them?
I mean, the idea in the industry, which was quite current, if you said, look, we've got lots of reserves in the future, the immediate response of government would be to stick taxation up. So there was a kind of incentive for the big companies in particular to underplay the significance of the province.
This makes it harder to get to grips with how much oil there is. But when I realise how much tax the government gets from this industry, maybe it's not surprising that the companies always opt for the conservative estimate. The black gold that's poured out of the North Sea has pumped billions into the Treasury's coffers. It starts with the licence companies have to buy to find the oil. They can cost anything from a few £1,000s to a few million. Then there's a tax. Since 1968, the oil companies have paid more than £230 billion in today's money on the oil they've extracted. First, there's corporation tax, which this year will be about £4.8 billion. Then there's a supplementary charge, a tax by another name. For the last 12 months, it adds up to £3.4 billion. It doesn't stop there. Some oil fields have an extra petroleum revenue tax charged on them. This year, that'll be another £1.7 billion. Oh, and all that's paid just to get the oil ashore. The taxation process starts again when the crude is refined to produce petrol, diesel or kerosene, with fuel duty and VAT. That brings in roughly £30 billion a year. For every £1 you spend at the pumps, 65p goes on tax, making you, the British motorist, the most highly taxed in Europe. We're all struggling with expensive fuel at the minute, but despite the price of crude oil, it's still cheaper per litre than a litre of bottled water. North Sea oil has boosted the government's bank balance, but oil reserves have even had a hand in deciding the fates of governments. Remember Britain's troubles in the 70s, the strikes, the crippling OPEC prices? Britain was so broke, it had to go to the world's banker, the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, for a loan.
We had some economic problems. In 1976, a year after the oil came ashore, we had this big row with the IMF. They wanted to make massive cuts. And I said to the Treasury, instead of publishing the gold and dollar reserves every month, why don't you publish the gold, dollar and oil reserves every month? Because if the world knew what we knew, the amount of oil that was available, then they would be less likely to try and bully us to make cuts. And of course the IMF cuts went through. I was opposed to it, but they went through.
Ben realised oil had the potential to change the course of a country, but he wasn't able to get his way. The IMF loan had its price, spending cuts, and the impact of those cuts sent shockwaves through Britain.
They went through. Triggered off the winter discontent, and Mrs. Thatcher won the election. I think it all flowed from that. And on the whole, the Treasury was reluctant to recognise the wealth that was there because they wanted to use the crisis to force cuts on a Labour government. I think that's my interpretation of what was happening anyway.
Oil shapes economies. Oil decides the political direction of countries. And according to Tony Benn, how Labour handled North Sea oil was indirectly responsible for Thatcherism. And oil played a crucial role throughout the Thatcher years.
The taxes became big from about 1980 onwards. The tax revenues reached in 1984 in money of the day, £12 billion. We were talking, maybe 24 at today's prices. So there was a huge influx of money to the exchequer, and the balance of payments was transformed such that sterling, which in the 70s had of course had a very difficult time with devaluations and so on, became a remarkably strong currency, and that of course caused other problems because our exporters of manufactured goods kept complaining about oil as being one of the causes of the strong pound.
The revenue from the North Sea allowed Margaret Thatcher to reverse the economic policies of the 70s. She believed in the free market, so she even sold off Britain's national oil company. Britain was awash with oil money.
There are many people could argue that in the grand manner of governments, they chucked it around and threw it away. The fact is that North Sea oil did help to restructure the British economy. The British economy is nothing like what it was in 1974-75, 76, when oil began to come ashore. Nothing like it was, and therefore that money, you could argue, was used to restructure the British economy, on which we have lived quite well for a number of years now. I think you could also argue that it was used to refurbish Britain. Britain was looking pretty shabby in the mid-70s. It looks much better now if you disregard the litter that we're knee-deep in. But I think the fabric of Britain has been greatly improved since then.
The money from the oil off Scotland's coast bankrolled Thatcherism. Once again, understanding oil allows us to understand a major economic phenomenon in Scotland's modern history.
The person who got the maximum proceeds out of oil and gas was Margaret Thatcher. And I mean, if you like, the oil and gas revenues were used to bankroll monetarism. I mean, the monetarist experiment in the UK economy, whether you like it or hate it, could never have happened at all without the 12, 14, 16 billion pounds which were flowing in at that time, a fairly substantial proportion of UK's overall revenues. Interestingly enough, oil revenues are now back at that sort of nominal level, but of course it's a much smaller proportion of the UK's revenue base.
Margaret Thatcher used that money to restructure the economy. But in Scotland, not everyone agreed with the way she spent the North Sea oil revenues.
What I did very much regret was that the way things turned out, the oil revenues ended up financing unemployment to quite a large extent in the early 1980s, because we then had a very serious recession and the pound is very high, companies were collapsing, and effectively the oil was financing unemployment, and that was not at all what should have happened.
While oil was covering the cost of Britain's unemployment, it was bringing boom times to a small community in the north of Scotland. The discovery of large deposits of oil more than 200 miles from the Scottish mainland presented massive logistical problems. How were the companies going to get their oil to market? It was only 50 miles to Shetland. It made sense for the companies to lay a pipeline and build a terminal there where the oil could be stored before being shipped to refineries. How the Shetlanders responded to the oil companies reveals much about their character and spirit. Some didn't want the oil or the changes it would bring. Could they benefit from the oil and preserve their way of life?
I remember a colleague in the Scottish office saying, "Oh dear, Shetland, they're bound to ride roughshod over them. It's one of Scotland's smallest and weakest local authorities." I mean, that chap just didn't know Ian Clark.
The love of money, says Paul, is the root of all evil.
And it proved to be otherwise. And it was quite extraordinary that he happened to be there. But he was an extraordinarily tough and determined individual. And, and he forced the issue with the oil companies.
Ian Clark was the chief executive of the Shetland Islands Council. He knew the oil companies had to use Shetland. His plan was to force through an Act of Parliament, giving the council complete control of the shoreline. This would give them the power to make all the oil companies use the same terminal, minimising the disturbance. He then made them pay for the privilege, and this money became the Shetland Oil Fund.
As I understood it, what happened was that one of the oil companies came to Ian Clark and said, "If you agree to us having our own terminal, we'll do what we do in Anglesey and give you a throughput charge on the oil that goes through it." And he said more or less, "Well, thanks for the idea, but you're still going to have a common user terminal." And that gave them the lever with which they got their oil fund.
The sticking point was how much the companies would pay, and it was only resolved when the Scottish Secretary called a meeting.
Willie Ross summoned them to Parliament, and he said to them, "I'm very sympathetic and I'm prepared to be reasonable, but you mustn't push your luck too far because we must have this oil developed, and if necessary we'll have to legislate." I mean, that's my memory of it. It may not be entirely accurate, but that was what actually eventually broke the logjam, and the Shetlanders then settled and they got a large amount of money out of it.
So do you think that you've beaten the oil companies in any way?
Oh no, not at all. Not at all. It would be a brave man who thought that he could beat the oil companies.
I remember that John Drummond of Shell saying to me that he'd met a lot of very difficult people in the world, including Colonel Gaddafi, but Mr. Clark was the most difficult of them all. And, you know, I think a lot of people felt a bit like that. But he got what he wanted, and Shetland owes a great deal to him. And it didn't hold up the development in the end.
Shetland secured what you could call an oil fund. It's already spent almost half of it, but there's still £500 million left. Oil has transformed Shetland and it's still shaping it today. Who benefits from North Sea oil is a fundamental question. Who gets the money has been influencing politics in Scotland for the last 30 years, and it's central to the nationalist argument.
That is not surprising, bearing in mind they smelt money.
Did they not have a point that perhaps it was their oil, most of it was just off the shore of Scotland?
Well, they had the point if they were as greedy as sin as they were. I mean, the only thing that fueled nationalism was the smell of oil and money in oil. I mean, it really is the most monstrous piety on their part to say that they are true upholders of the saltire and God knows what. They were after brass, and not let's kid ourselves.
But I suppose it gave the argument credibility for the first time.
Well, certainly it did. I mean, it was an entirely credible argument. We want money for Scots, and blow the English and the Welsh. Oh, yes, yes, but that I think would now be described as greed.
The case for self-government has been running in Scotland as a serious political issue for 100 years. I mean, 1967 was the first big breakthrough in modern political times, which really was a bit before oil was thought of. Certainly there was an impact of oil which gave the argument more economic credibility, which is of course why Bernard Ingham was so desperate to try and knock it down using any tactic he possibly could. It was fear that motivated Bernard Ingham. He was there as an operator trying to undermine. But what he mistakes is the impact of oil on economic confidence as opposed to oil creating Scottish nationalism. The Scottish nationalism is existence because Scotland is a nation. That's why people believe in independence for Scotland. The problem for somebody like Bernard Ingham, he can't get his head around the fact that Scotland is a country, not a county.
There's a lot of jobs in Scotland, don't forget that. I mean, the benefit didn't just come in the revenues, but also the jobs that were created, which I was very keen on developing, and the production for equipment that was needed for the North Sea. So I never saw it as a dominant factor, but it is a fact that having been told for so long we're uneconomic, then we finally are economic, and we're still treated as a second-class citizens. That's why I've always very strongly supported the Scottish Parliament.
Scottish nationalism existed long before the oil off Scotland's shore started flowing. But oil did give this political argument some economic credibility. It provided nationalists with a means of financing an independent Scotland. Did they still see it as Scotland's oil?
It's Scotland's oil in the sense that the natural resource, or at least about 90% of it, lies in the waters around Scotland. I suppose you could argue it's not to date been Scotland's oil in the sense that the major economic benefit, the economic rent, the revenues, the £250,000 million, the £50,000 a head for every man, woman, child in this country have flowed straight from the North Sea to the Treasury coffers in London.
But some of that has come back to Scotland again. Some would say
almost as much as has gone into the Treasury coffers in the first case?
Well, there's no real argument. If you do the balance of £250,000 million, there's no way the Treasury has given Scotland £250,000 million over the last 25 years. I mean, that'd be nonsensical to believe that.
Over the years, the benefit hasn't quite amounted to Alex Salmond's £250,000 million. But in today's money, that's roughly what's gone to Westminster.
I personally think that without oil, if Scotland was self-financing, it would have to either raise taxes or cut public expenditure. The figures all show that, and unless you disbelieve them, which some people do, you know, that's the conclusion you're bound to come to. But then the oil revenues are substantial, and at present prices, they would make a huge difference if they were all coming to Scotland. But it wouldn't be a very good idea, even now, just to use them to prop up current expenditure.
So far in my investigation, I've spoken to politicians, economists and historians about how oil has shaped Scotland. But I need to talk to people who work in the industry to find out how it'll shape it in the years to come. Could the oil that's still in the North Sea be even more important to Scotland in the future? Well, the first person I'm going to talk to is oil engineer Capella Fester.
Well, I would say that the easy oil is running out. I think we would probably all be agreed on that. But there's an awful lot more down there. And what is giving people, I think, the buzz now is that we have the technology to be able to go after it. We have the right economic environment to be able to go after it. And quite frankly, I think we have the expertise to be able to go after it. So I think that's what is exciting people and opening up all kinds of opportunities with technology to significantly extend the expected life of these fields.
So could this technology and expertise help shape Scotland's future in oil?
I just look at our company's experiences alone and what we've done from a technological point of view, just imagine some of the things that we've done with respect to directional drilling. Place yourself at the top of the Walter Scott Monument, for example, and push a piece of spaghetti down through the monument and all the way through someone's letterbox on the shorefront in Leith. That's what we can do with drilling.
How can this technology benefit Scotland and oil in the future?
Where the oil sits underneath.
Geophysicists like Russell Reekie might hold the key to getting the most out of the North Sea oil fields.
This really illustrates just what a narrow envelope we've got to place these wells in. But if I exaggerate it a little, I can exaggerate it a lot so it looks like mountains, and this is what we'd probably prefer to have. And we're really drilling in quite a narrow band. We've got a minimum height above our oil-water contact of about 30 feet to allow us to maximise production. So you're probably talking around about this contour here.
These geologists are vital to Scotland, constantly reassessing how much oil there is. They're showing me what they can see thousands of feet below the seabed. They make it sound as if they can hit a haystack from 2 miles away, blindfolded. So why is this accuracy so important?
If we actually move one of the vertical slices into the middle part of the data, you see that there's a fairly obvious feature appears.
What's that?
This is actually a salt dome that's present at this part of the North Sea.
Does that affect how you would get the oil and gas out, how you would get to it, and how much it might cost you to do that?
Very much, actually, because although the salt dome is fantastic for producing the trap that has allowed the oil and gas to accumulate, it's also a potential drilling hazard for us as well. So, and it will force us to make sure that we avoid the salt dome with the wells. So it's a feature that we can map out in detail with the 3D seismic, and that helps us with the well planning.
When I find out that a simple oil well costs $22 million to drill, I can see why all this science is necessary. But how has this critical mass of expertise affected Scotland and the North East?
North Sea oil is ensuring that unemployment in Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire has been extraordinarily low for the last number of years. North Sea oil, in the wider sense of the fact that it is here, means that the oil and gas cluster can operate on an international basis as well.
Some comments on what happened.
My investigation has shown me that all these highly skilled jobs are putting the North East in a unique position. But I need to find out how Aberdeen can capitalise on this in the future. This is off the west coast of Ireland, so you're here in Aberdeen and you can monitor what's happening there.
Correct. Real time.
What is the process that allows you to see everything changing here?
We have subsurface tools with sensors in them. If you're familiar with an MRI scan, we've got some tools that we occasionally use, which is like an inside-out MRI scan to see what's happening in the reservoir fluids.
Really?
But most of the time, this is looking at electrical responses or acoustic responses to evaluate what's happening. And then we can correlate our subsurface models with what's actually happening downstairs and correct it accordingly.
The satellite communications making all that possible have another use on unmanned production platforms.
We can control subsea wells that are perhaps sitting in Dundee in 500 foot of water from some sort of control centre in the middle of Glasgow. You know, the contribution that Aberdeen and the UK industry has made to the global oil and gas industry is clearly recognised.
So I'll take you through now to the test area for the satellite systems. And,
Scots like Tom Smith have been part of that process, helping to drive the industry and Scotland's future. So what would this be simulating?
So if the vessel's moving around, this will show the range of movement that it can accommodate whilst it can just fix onto the satellite beam. But behind this, on the vessel, you would have all the technology. It could be closed-circuit cameras, it could be voice, it could be data, it could be networks, all coming through this communication pipe that goes up to the satellite and come back. So really, although
being shown this satellite technology, I realise how it has enabled Scotland to become the epicentre of Europe's oil industry, one of Britain's best-kept secrets.
It's the hidden jewel in the UK industrial crown. I mean, it's fantastic. For Aberdeen, it's been totally game-changing. It's hard to imagine what the UK would have been like, but even more particularly for me as an Aberdonian, what Aberdeen would have been like without the oil and gas industry. It's the discipline of the oil and gas industry in terms of quality, delivery, just the whole issue about how good you've got to be in delivering high quality, high integrity systems and solutions has been a great discipline that we can actually take to other markets and other sectors. So I think it's been a fantastic game changer, as I say, for Aberdeen.
Tom Smith's company Nesco is now a global operation headquartered in Aberdeen. That's been the biggest step change for the oil industry. The big oil producers are still here, but they're supported by 3,000 oil and gas companies. Some of them are now global businesses run by Scots. There are other examples of Scotland's pioneering spirit in the oil industry. For instance, one of the things that I've discovered is that oil producers normally only extract a third of the oil from a reservoir and leave the rest. But in the North Sea, that convention's being thrown out. There's nothing normal about the oil off our coast. Petroleum engineer and chief executive of Oilexco, Arthur Mulholland.
The North Sea has been blessed with what we call some world-class source rock. But because they're such high quality, means that the amount of oil that you can recover from the reservoirs is also very high. Where I was trained in Western Canada, a good oil reservoir will give up about 30 to 35% of the oil in place, and that's all you're going to recover. But here, in the offshore here, it's substantially higher than that. You have reservoirs here that will give up 60 to 65% of the oil in place. And in some of the reservoirs, if you try to work the technology a little bit, you may be able to incrementally increase some even more than that.
In the early 70s, the Forties field and its platforms were an engineering marvel. Today, the technology that's around is extending the life of these older oil fields. World-class geology and science, as well as a high oil price, means many fields are now being redeveloped. Capella Fester is leading a team dedicated to the future of the Forties field.
It was discovered in the 60s, so it's been producing for a good number of years now. Estimates are that sort of 52% probably of what was there has been produced. So already, well beyond the 35 that you mentioned. But as we go forward, we find there is more and more opportunity, given the technology that we have, to go after oil in Forties. So we're working quite closely with Apache to look back at some of the history of Forties, of how the oil was produced and where it came from, with a view to starting to look forward and say, well, where is the oil now, and how can we approach this in a different way? How can we involve technology to make sure that we just get every last drop that is economically possible?
BP discovered and owned the Forties field until 5 years ago. They'd taken the easy oil out, nearly 2.5 billion barrels, before they sold it to the American company Apache. Their chief executive is Jim Howes.
Forties was definitely showing her age when Apache took it. At the time when it was sold, and this is in public records, and I'll speak in round terms, the proved developed reserves that were on the books were in the range of 150 million barrels. We ended last year with over 200 million barrels on the books. And this is through drilling, shooting new seismic surveys, reevaluating the field, and doing things that a company like Apache does, reinvesting into the asset and finding ways to extend reserve recoveries. Also, the rate's up. We had one of the best months in March that we've had since 2006. We averaged a little over 66,000 barrels a day for the month.
Forties is now producing more oil than anyone ever thought possible at this stage. Its oil reserves have increased, yet the oil was meant to run out in the 90s. The more I've investigated, the more lies I've led to rest, and the more truths I've discovered. Not just about the oil, but Scotland itself. Getting more oil out of the North Sea is creating new challenges, and Scots are responding to these challenges. I've seen innovation, technology, and a sense of drive that some people say Scotland lacks. Well, it's not lacking here in Aberdeen, it's thriving. And the reason it's thriving is oil.
We have a lot of infrastructure that might not have been there. I mean, Aberdeen Airport was completely rebuilt. A lot of housing was built in the northeast, especially around Aberdeen. I mean, the Grampian region of Scotland became one of the wealthiest parts of the United Kingdom, and still is. And the Scottish economy, which used to have a GDP per head, which was way down at the bottom of the league table, is now well up, I mean, only the southeast of England and a couple of other English regions have a higher income per head than Scotland has. That wasn't the position before. So, I mean, there has been quite a big change, but a lot of this impact was actually in the northeast rather than in other places.
It's made a major impact on the economy of Scotland and indeed Britain as a whole. It's created huge amounts of skilled jobs, and it's rightly earned us a huge reputation of being a true centre of global excellence when it comes to energy.
The industry is now worth nearly £4 billion to Aberdeen. It's made Scotland an industrial world leader, just like shipbuilding did in the last century. Hopefully the lessons of that era have been learned.
The big realization that I think we have right now in 2008 is that we have a globally recognized industry here in the UK and in Scotland. 400,000 people employed, leading edge technology, not just serving the UK sector. There are companies here in Aberdeen that are serving markets in Indonesia, South America, the Gulf of Mexico, with recognized leading edge technology. Rather similar to the strength of our shipbuilding industry after the post-war period. And what we should not fall into the trap of doing is letting this industry wither away like perhaps we let the Lower Clyde wither away.
There's no doubt that oil has helped to shape Scotland's modern history, but the relationship seems to be changing. There's a new sense of confidence in the industry, and it's driven by Scottish expertise and innovation. In the future, it looks like Scotland will be shaping oil.
The first oil that was ever discovered in North America was in Ontario, Canada, and today what is a little town called Oil Springs, which is nearby another town called Petroleum. And the field is still on production. It makes about 130 barrels of oil per day. It went on production in 1858. So I guess that's the oldest oil field actually in the world, and it's still on production, so it hasn't closed.
Euro 2008, my money is on France.
I support Spain at the moment.
I'll go for Romania, why not? Because it'd be funny.
Fernando Torres they've got, I like Fernando Torres.
Oh, he's a genius, and he must have a Scottish grandmother.
He's just, I think he's elastic.
Ronaldo can set the place alight.
Definitely, yeah.